Welcome back to Journal Club, and today we're talking about epibiotic green algae on a turbot. So, the turbot is a large species of flatfish native to the Northeast Atlantic, the Baltic Sea, and the Mediterranean. And specifically, what we're talking about today is Scophthalmus maximus. Turbot can also refer to the entire family of flatfish and some individuals outside of Scophthalmus, like the Greenland turbot. Turbot likely comes from the Latin turbo, meaning spinning top, in reference to its shape. And like other flatfish, these fish have both eyes on one side of the head facing upwards. They actually start out with their eyes on opposite sides of the head, and then those eyes migrate during metamorphosis. And so in other species of flatfish, you end up with either right side of the headedness or left side of the headedness in terms of what is up. Or there's the spiny turbots, which can turn out either right-sided or left-sided. And apparently they are delicious because turbot is a relatively commonly farmed fish, making up about a third of that total flatfish agriculture. And I kind of believe it for this last guy. He looks sort of like one of my beloved Tapatio Doritos. Hey Doritos, it's been a minute. The offer still stands. All this could be yours for just some of those sweet, sweet Tapatio Doritos. And just listen to what the fans are saying. Like some guy in the bus says, that's kind of interesting, I guess. And my parents give this series a half-hearted thumbs up. And what do you know, that's the same sort of enthusiasm I have for the sad beige Doritos. Now, unlike in Doritos, probably, bacterial disease is a significant concern in the turbot industry, and this poses significant threats to sustainability, fish welfare, and productivity in farmed turbot. And one disease of specific concern in the farmed turbot industry is what's called furunculosis. Now, this is the chronic form of an aeromonas infection, which forms these ulcers over the dermal tubercles. These are structures similar to scales with a bony core. Now, this isn't really furunculosis, which typically refers to inflammation of the hair follicle, so ulcerative dermatitis may be a more appropriate descriptor. If you're thinking aeromonas, where do I know that from? It also causes septicemia and hemorrhagic disease in a lot of farmed fish. So this study is looking at a turbot farm in Galicia, which is in northwestern Spain. This farm was hit by a tropical storm, which then removed all of these coverings from the tanks. And so during the repair process, some of the tanks were left open to the sun for a couple days, and shortly after that exposure, the farm staff noticed algae growing on some of the turbot in a tank with those chronic aeromonas infections. So this is what chronic aeromonas normally looks like. So this is the dermal tubercle, which is that raised portion, and then it's got the central ulcer surrounded by a ring of pink, which is erosion, granulation tissue, and inflammatory infiltrate. This is what they were seeing coming off of the fish. And I will admit, when I read the title, I was thinking of like a little bit of scummy green stuff growing on the skin. You know, kind of like how sloths grow algae on their fur. This is not at all what I was picturing. Like, I'm kind of expecting the fish to start singing Now That We're Men. But these tufts are up to 10 centimeters in length and firmly attached to the skin at the tubercle. And this is one of those tubercles removed from the fish. And this is what it looks like histologically. So at low magnification, we have a thickened hyperplastic epidermis with this central ulcer overlying the tubercle. That bony tubercle is then protruding through that ulcer, and it's surrounded by a whole bunch of purple inflammatory cells that are in the dermis. Looking at the edges of that tubercle, they're also kind of scalloped, so that's representing resorption of the bone, and then the surface of the algae matches that scalloped edge. So that big purple billowy thing at the top that looks like it's erupting from a volcano, that's our algae. Looking a bit closer at where the algae meets epidermis, we can see that the algal lamella is crossing the epidermis in the basement membrane and extends into the dermis. The inset in the bottom right is showing the inflammatory infiltrate, which is dominated by epithelioid macrophages that are doing their best to wall things off. They're supported by some lymphocytes and a multinucleated giant cell. And then this is the algae itself. So this organism is composed of layers of cells arranged to form this fixation disc where it all holds together, and then it gives rise to these bilayered lamellae. So naturally we have to see this on electron microscopy. Transmission electron microscopy, probably not as helpful, but they did scanning electron microscopy to see the interaction between the algae and the skin surface. Scanning EM is the kind that shows you the outside of the cells at a really high resolution, so think of like the Secret Life of Cells video. The TEM gives you that flat photo that shows you the ultrastructure of the cell, or basically where all the organelles are. So this is the exposed surface of that tubercle bone, and it's got all these little caves, which are called resorption lacunae, where the algal lamellae are inserting into the bone. It's kind of like roots clinging to a rock. And then looking even closer at the surface of those lamellae, they are playing host to a very diverse biofilm composed of heterogeneous bacteria and yeast. And they did do PCR on that lamellae to confirm that part of that biofilm is composed of aeromonas. So not only is aeromonas forming the ulcer, but it's also living on the algae. So since we have this algae growing on the fish opportunistically, and since there's not a lot of difference between the inflammatory reaction here and the inflammatory reaction with aeromonas that doesn't have algae, this suggests that the algae is using those tubercles as more of an anchoring substrate rather than parasitizing the fish. And this is called epibiosis, when an organism grows on but doesn't harm the other organism. Now, morphologically, this is most similar to an algae in the genus Ulva, which is green macroalgae known as sea lettuces, and in the wild they tend to grow on inert substances like rocks. They're pretty ubiquitous in shallow marine water. So most likely sun exposure with those dermal tubercles allowed the algae to grow on the bone just like how it would grow on rock. But this isn't entirely harmless. The algae is not getting anything out of the deal, but it is acting as a foreign body on the fish. So not only will that prevent the skin from growing over the ulcer, but it may also provide a source for that aeromonas bacteria to persist.